Welcome, dear listener, to Candlelight Mysteries, where every whisper hides a truth and every shadow conceals a secret. Tonight, as the wind sighs against the glass and the flame trembles low, we invite you into another tale of suspense and candlelight. Let the mystery begin. The candlelight beginning. The village of St. Mary Mead slumbered beneath a gentle autumn rain, the kind that whispered through the hedgerows and silvered the cobblestones like fallen starlight. The air was steeped in the faint perfume of wet earth and wood smoke, and beyond the vicarage, the old church bell tolled 10, a sound so melancholy it seemed to echo across the very bones of the countryside. Inside the manor house at Windermere Lodge, the glow of candelabra flickered against crimson wallpaper, casting long, wavering silhouettes that danced like restless ghosts. The evening's dinner party had drawn its final breath. Silver cutlery lay abandoned beside half-eaten desserts, and the faint murmur of polite conversation dwindled into uneasy silence. Lady Agatha Windermere sat at the head of the mahogany table, her posture still elegant despite her age. Her fingers toyed absently with a lace handkerchief, a fine thing, ivory white and delicately embroidered with roses. Around her the guests exchanged uneasy glances, for something intangible yet sinister hung in the air. The butler, Mr. Hargreaves, had just poured the final glass of port when Lady Agatha's laughter, brittle and hollow, cut through the hush. "You see," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly, "the dead never really leave us. They wait patiently." A shiver rippled through the company. Colonel Denton, his face flushed from brandy, gave a nervous chuckle.
"Good Lord, Agatha!
"You'll have us all jumping at shadows before the night's through." "Perhaps you should," she replied softly, her gaze drifting toward the lace cloth draped over the piano. "For shadows, my dear Colonel, are where the truth hides." Moments later, the candles flickered. One by one the flames guttered out, and darkness enveloped the room. A gasp, the faint sound of glass shattering, and then silence. When light returned, Lady Agatha was slumped over the table, her pale hand outstretched, the lace handkerchief still clutched between her fingers. A crimson stain spread slowly across its delicate pattern, blooming like a rose in snow. Mrs. Whitfield screamed. The butler froze, and somewhere in the distance the wind moaned low through the trees, as though mourning the soul that had just departed. Outside, in a small cottage at the edge of the village, an elderly woman with kind blue eyes looked up from her knitting. The clock on her mantel chimed 10, and Miss Jane Marple frowned ever so slightly. She could not say why, and only that somewhere something had just gone terribly, terribly wrong. The rain thickened. The lace at Windermere Lodge fluttered gently in the draught from an open window, as though whispering the first secret of the night. And as the last candle burned to a trembling wick, its flame shivered and went out. Chapter. The morning after the storm found St. Mary Mead washed clean but unsettled. Mist clung to the hedgerows and drifted low across the meadows like a dream reluctant to end. From the chimney of Windermere Lodge rose a single frail thread of smoke, an almost indecent sign of life from a house so recently visited by death. Miss Marple arrived at 10 o'clock precisely, her sensible hat pinned neatly in place and her umbrella tapping softly against the gravel as she was greeted by Constable Reeves at the gate. He looked pale, uncertain, the way young men often did when confronted by something larger and darker than they'd imagined life could contain. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, fumbling with his notebook. "I didn't expect you quite so early." "My dear boy," she said gently, "death waits for no one, but neither should truth." They crossed the threshold into the manor's hall, where the smell of beeswax and roses mingled oddly with something sharper, the faint, unmistakable tang of decay. Lady Agatha's body had been discovered at dawn, still seated in her chair. Leonard, the village physician, had been called immediately, and the verdict was unsettling, poisoning. Yet what remained mysterious was the how at the dining table. Miss Marple paused, her sharp blue eyes taking in every detail, the overturned wine glass, the scattered crumbs of Madeira cake, and most notably, the lace handkerchief lying folded beside the untouched port glass. "It was her own lace," said Mr. Hargreaves, his voice trembling. "She embroidered it herself years ago. Always said lace was a woman's armour. Delicate, but strong." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Indeed. And much like armour, it sometimes hides what lies beneath." The other guests were gathered in the drawing-room. Colonel Denton, still red-faced and irritable, his hands trembling around a cigarette. Mrs. Whitfield, the widowed neighbour, fluttering like a trapped bird. Mr. Oliver Gray, the family solicitor, grave and composed, and Beatrice Windermere, Lady Agatha's niece, pale, elegant, and unreadable, her eyes hidden beneath the dark fringe of mourning. "I suppose you've come to look, Miss Marple?" said Colonel Denton, attempting gruff civility. "Terrible business. The police say poison. Never thought such a thing possible here?" "Oh, but poison is frightfully ordinary," Miss Marple said quietly. "It's simply another way of telling the truth." Unpleasantly, a silence followed. Mrs. Whitfield dabbed her eyes with a perfumed handkerchief. "I warned her," she whispered. "I told her she'd gone too far, digging into the past like that." Miss Marple turned. "The past? Yes, she'd received a letter a week ago. It upset her dreadfully, or she said it was from someone long dead. That caught everyone's attention. Even Beatrice looked up sharply. Colonel Denton muttered, "Superstition." But Miss Marple's gaze had already drifted toward the piano, the same piano over which the lace cloth had been thrown the night before. She walked toward it, her steps light and careful. Upon the surface, faint as breath, were fingerprints in the dust. Small, delicate, almost childlike. "Tell me," she said softly, "was there a child in the house?" Beatrice shook her head. "No, not since—" She stopped. "Not since when?" Miss Marple asked. The younger woman's lips trembled. "Not since my mother died 20 years ago." "She was Lady Agatha's sister?" Miss Marple's voice was mild, but her eyes had sharpened. "And she died of what?" "Poison," Beatrice whispered. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that seems to make the air itself lean in to listen. By midday, Inspector Crail had arrived from the county station, a tall, grim man with an expression like carved granite. He had no patience for village talk or tea-time theories, yet he had learned enough of Miss Marple's reputation to nod politely when she offered him a seat. "Doctor says it was arsenic," he began, flipping through his notes. "Small amount, enough to kill, slipped in through the port glass. All guests were served from the same bottle. Yet only Lady Agatha drank hers." "Convenient," Miss Marple murmured. He raised a brow. "You think someone tampered with her glass alone?" "Oh, I think someone tampered with far more than that, Inspector." The butler, Hargreaves, was questioned next. His account was painfully ordinary. He'd served as always, poured as always, left the room as always. But under Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny, he faltered when she asked about the lace. "It was there, ma'am." "On the table when I returned. I thought it odd, her placing it over the glass like that." "Ah," said Miss Marple softly. "Over the glass, you say?" "Not beneath?" "No, ma'am, over, just before she drank." The faintest smile touched Miss Marple's lips. "Curious." And quite telling. That afternoon, while the rain began again, Miss Marple wandered the halls of Windermere Lodge alone. In the sewing-room she found what she had suspected, boxes upon boxes of lace, each delicately folded and labelled. Some were pale and new, others had yellowed with age. Yet one box, half hidden beneath a shawl, contained scraps darkened with something more than time. She lifted one between her fingers and frowned. The lace was stiff, faintly discoloured, and a residue she recognised all too well, arsenic, or something kin to it. The door creaked behind her. Beatrice stood there, her face pale as ivory. "You shouldn't be here," she said, voice trembling. "Nor should a poisoner," Miss Marple replied gently. The girl's eyes filled with tears. "You think it was me?" "I think," said Miss Marple, "that lace is a strange thing to inherit, beautiful, but cursed with memory." Beatrice turned away, clutching her shawl. "You don't understand. My aunt, she destroyed lives with her secrets. She said lace like truth must never be cut, but she lied. She cut it all the time. Miss Marple said nothing. Only the ticking of the clock filled the silence, slow, inexorable, like the pulse of fate. When she returned home that evening, she carried with her a single scrap of lace, folded neatly in her handbag. The rain had stopped, but in the still air of her cottage, the faintest scent of bitter almonds lingered, and Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire, whispered to herself, "Poison beneath the lace indeed." Chapter 2. A grey noon lay over St. Mary Mead, like a veil that had not quite been shaken free of the morning's rain. Miss Marple, never one to be hurried by weather or men, returned to Windermere Lodge with a basket on her arm containing what she called, with demure pride, a few civilizing influences, scones in a napkin, a pot of blackcurrant jam, and a folded shawl that looked as though it might have known a more delicate shoulder in 1898. One learns much, in Miss Marple's experience, when one has an excuse to sit and pore. Inspector Crail met her at the door with a mien that suggested he considered both lace and jam as obstacles to the efficient march of justice. "I am obliged for your interest, Miss Marple," he said, in a tone that meant not at all obliged, "but we must proceed with formal interviews. I've arranged them in the study. You may observe if you please, but kindly refrain from coaching answers." "My dear Inspector," Miss Marple replied, eyes mild beneath the brim of her sensible hat, "I have never coached anything but roses and weak tea. But I will do my best not to interfere with either." She smiled, and when Miss Marple smiled, obstinate men often found their tempers smoothed as if by a discreet ironing. The study at Windermere Lodge was a handsome, shadowed room. Books stood like jurors in solemn rows, and the window, flung open against the scent of damp leaves, admitted a citron light that made the dust motes visible as they rose and fell in quiet judgment. A black lacquer writing desk faced the garden, and on it, in a cut-glass tray, lay an assortment of correspondence, letters tied with faded ribbon, a thin paper knife in the form of a swan, and on one corner, a scrap of lace coiled like a sleeping moth. Miss Marple's eyes alighted on that lace and did not for a moment move. Then she folded her hands and seated herself in a low chair by the hearth, as if preparing to knit the afternoon into a pattern only she could see. Crail's first interview was with Mr. Hargreaves, the butler. The man's long, spare figure seemed made of angles. His collar was too stiff, his cheekbones too prominent, his dignity too brittle. Yet grief, genuine or expertly rehearsed, lay like frost on his voice. "State again," Inspector Crail said. "The order of service last night." Hargreaves clasped his hands. "We dined at 8, sir. Soup, fish, roast, a partridge, and the Madeira cake, as is customary for Lady Windermere on a Thursday. After dessert, I was commanded to bring in the port and the ladies' liqueurs. I placed the decanter on the tray, 6 small glasses in a ring, and the ladies were offered crème de menthe, or cherry brandy, while the gentlemen took port. Her ladyship said she would join the gentlemen for once. I poured for each. Then I withdrew to fetch the coffee, and when you returned? The candles had guttered, sir. Mrs. Whitfield was calling for light. I relit the sconces. Her ladyship was slumped. I set the tray down here on this very desk and went at once for Dr. Leonard. You saw nothing added to the glass? No powders, no tinctures? No, sir. Hargreaves' face pinched. Her ladyship herself took up her lace and, if you will pardon me, she placed it over the rim of the glass, as if to add an air of mischief. She laughed. Then she sipped. It was only a moment. Miss Marple looked up softly. Was that her custom, Mr. Hargreaves? A little theatrical flourish with the lace. No, ma'am. Her ladyship was fond of small dramas, but not so... Not thus. He paused, swallowing. And yet she did it with an air of recognition, as if repeating a thing known to her. Known? Miss Marple repeated, her gaze drifting to the coiled moth of lace on the desk. Yes, known. Inspector Crail cleared his throat. Thank you, Hargreaves. You may go for now, but do not leave the house. Hargreaves bowed and retreated. his retreat formal and faintly funereal. Lace, Crail muttered as the door shut. Arsenic in a decanter is comprehensible. But lace? Miss Marple's knitting fingers, though bereft of yarn, moved once in her lap. Lace is a net, Inspector. The question is not whether one can catch a fish in it, but which fish will swim toward it of his own accord. He eyed her with wry resignation. Very pretty. But arsenic is a prosaic devil. It must get into the body somehow. I'll not have phantoms where a teaspoon will do. Quite right, Miss Marple said serenely. I, too, am very fond of teaspoons. Mrs. Whitfield, the next to be admitted, arrived like a summer storm. Quick tears, fluttering hands, and a perfume that spoke of violets in a sorrowful garden. She wore sorrow as some women wear fur, soft about the throat. Extravagant in the sleeves, my dear Inspector, she exclaimed. I have hardly slept, hardly a moment. The image of poor Agatha. Her hand went to her eyes, and I had warned her. I told her quite solemnly that dragging up the past would end in blood. Inspector Crail's pen paused. You warned Lady Agatha of blood, madam. Not literally, surely, Mrs. Whitfield amended with a little tremor. One doesn't say such things, not in a drawing-room. But I meant it. Oh, indeed I did. She had been prying, you see, into old letters and older sins, and she told me, that she had written to a man who had no business receiving letters, not after 20 years. Or was it 22? Who? Crail asked. Mrs. Whitfield's pretty powdered brow furrowed. I cannot recall the name. Something English and cold, like a November field. But I know this, a response came, and when Agatha read it, she turned the colour of bad milk. He writes from beyond the grave, she gasped. Such talk, abracadabra. I told her to burn it. Miss Marple's voice threaded the room like fine silk. Did she? Agatha burned nothing but bridges, Mrs. Whitfield said with a small, tragic laugh. She kept everything. Letters, ribbons, broken promises. It made her feel powerful. Power, Miss Marple murmured, half to herself. Power and lace and arsenic? She was thinking of the sewing room and the box of yellowed fragments, of the stiffness that had not come from starch alone. Crail resumed. Where were you seated last night, Mrs. Whitfield? Opposite dear Beatrice. We spoke of flowers. She has the Windermere pallor, poor child, though very lovely, a fragile look like bone china. And your glass? I took cherry brandy. I loathe port. It tastes to me like velvet gone wrong. You saw Lady Agatha place the lace over her glass? Yes, Mrs. Whitfield said, shuddering lightly. A theatrical trick. Agatha loved to play at being the headmistress at revels. She remarked that lace made anything taste sweeter. It was not true, of course. No, Miss Marple said softly, almost absently. Not sweeter? Colonel Denton stamped in as though the floorboards were recruits under inspection. His moustache was the old imperial sort, his temper the colour of bluster, and yet beneath his noise there was weariness. War does that, it sands men to their grain. Damn nonsense, he declared before Crail could seat him. Poison like some Greek play. A gentleman dies by a bullet. A lady by her own stubbornness. I told Agatha not to tease. She teased. Teased whom, Colonel? Crail said. Beatrice, for one. The Colonel's moustache twitched. Niece or not, Agatha dangled that legacy before the poor girl as a cat dangles a bird. Said the Windermere lace would go to the one who deserved it. And then she'd ask, with that infernal little smile, what any of us had done to deserve anything at all. Miss Marple looked up. The lace was an heirloom, then? Of value? Sentimental and historical, Denton grunted. There's a rumour a piece of it was worn at court by some Windermere who flirted with George IV or some such. Valuable enough to tempt a collector, I dare say. But the real value to Agatha was its power to bind and to choke. She liked to see who choked. Crail tapped his pen. Your position at table? Left of the old girl. Hargreaves poured. I took port. Didn't much care for it myself. Her ladyship made a joke of lace and wine. Then the lights hiccuped. Cursed draught. And when they were back, there she was, head down. I thought she'd dropped a fork. You saw no one touch her glass? No, Inspector. And I looked. I have, if I may say so, a soldier's way of seeing the thing one oughtn't to miss. Miss Marple's smile was kind. Soldiers often miss only what is too small to salute. Denton gave her a look, startled into a short laugh despite himself. "Quite, Miss Marple, quite." "Colonel," Miss Marple added gently, "did Lady Agatha keep medicines? Tonic? Powders she might have dosed herself?" "Not that I know." "She claimed good English blood, and bad English memories were tonic enough." "And enemies?" Crail asked bluntly. Denton's gaze shifted to the window. "Enemies?" Agatha collected them like postcards. "Old servants dismissed without ceremony. A gardener who accused her of shorting wages. And that business with her sister, Beatrice's mother." He paused, jaw working. "That was the ugliest. People say anything. But I was here, and I say this, the air in this house turned sour after that death." He rose suddenly, as if unable to sit in the memory any longer. "You have what I know, Inspector. See that Beatrice comes to no harm." He marched out, his spirit a little ragged at the hem. Crail scribbled, "We'll see Miss Beatrice now." Beatrice entered with a composure that had cost her dearly. She was all restraint. The line of her black dress precise, the pearls at her throat small and true, her hands gripping one another, as if whatever she held within might otherwise escape. "Miss Windermere," Inspector Crail began, "you must forgive the repetition. We are obliged to the facts." "I prefer facts," Beatrice said. Her voice was clear water over stone. "They are less cruel than suspicion. You sat opposite Mrs. Whitfield?" "Yes." "You took liqueur?" "No, water." The faintest flicker touched her lips. "I have never liked sweet things. My aunt enjoyed telling people that I had all the bitterness and none of the sugar." You saw her handle the lace? A pause, and then, "Yes." She took up a handkerchief, the one she embroidered with roses. She laid it over the glass. "She said," Beatrice's voice tightened, then steadied. "She said, 'To market with a veil, my dear. That's how women buy the truth.'" Crail frowned. "Meaning?" "Meaning that she believed everything in life can be strained through something pretty." Miss Marple's quiet voice drifted between them. "Your mother died in this house." Beatrice's eyes, blue and brittle, moved to Miss Marple's face. "Yes, and the verdict then was also poison." "Arsenic," Beatrice said. "Mother kept a tonic for her nerves. They said she mistook a bottle. My aunt said carelessness is a sin with a particular taste. She never forgave her." A shadow crossed Beatrice's face, delicate and terrible. "She never forgave anyone." "Did your aunt keep letters?" Crail asked. "Yes," Beatrice said, glancing at the desk. "She believed secrets should be kept under paper. They fold better that way." "You know of a letter last week?" Miss Marple asked. Beatrice hesitated. The house seemed to hold its breath. "I know she received one that frightened her. I did not see the signature. I only saw the envelope. What about it?" "It was addressed in a child's hand," Beatrice said. "Round letters, careful loops, as if someone had copied their penmanship from a primer." Miss Marple felt, inside her mind, a stitch draw through two pieces of lace. "Small fingerprints upon the piano," she murmured. "A child's hand on an envelope." "There is no child in this house," Beatrice said. "There has not been a child in this house since—" She did not finish. Crail rose. "Thank you, Miss Windermere. We may ask more later." Beatrice inclined her head like a woman accustomed to bowing where it hurt. She turned to go, then paused. "Inspector." "There is one thing more." "The will?" Crail glanced up. "Yes." "My aunt had made a new one," Beatrice said. "Mr. Gray brought it yesterday afternoon. She intended to sign after dinner. She told me so. She said it would finish all games." "And did she sign?" Beatrice's eyes darkened. "No." Mr. Oliver Gray, family solicitor, entered like a straight line that found comfort in itself. His suit was the colour of winter rain. He had that legal air of smooth sorrow which can be pressed over any grave. "The will," Crail said, without ceremony. Gray inclined his head. "I brought a revised draft yesterday. Lady Windermere wished to alter certain bequests. A lace collection to Miss Windermere, funds to the parish, an annuity for Mr. Hargreaves. She spoke of feeling unwell in the morning, but perfectly lucid in the afternoon. She asked me to dine and remain after so that she might sign with witnesses." "Events prevented it. Who suggested the alterations?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Lady Windermere," Gray replied. "She had a mind like a ledger when it came to property. Cold, but neat. And if the will remained unsigned," Crail said, pen poised, The previous will stand. Yes, Gray said and folded his hands. In which Miss Windermere's position is less certain. The lace collection, valuable to the family, was to be sold to establish an educational fund in Lady Windermere's name. The niece would receive a stipend, not the thing itself. Miss Marple's eyes lay on his face like a feather one still feels after it has drifted away.
"And who benefits most by the will remaining unsigned, Mr. Gray?"
Gray's mouth tightened.
"That sort of arithmetic is for your ledger, Inspector, not mine. Nevertheless," Crail said.
Name. Gray's gaze flicked, for a fraction, to the door through which Beatrice had gone. Miss Windermere, silence. A clock ticked. Somewhere down the corridor, a maid coughed and remembered not to cough. Miss Marple reached out and very delicately touched the scrap of lace on the desk. "Did Lady Agatha ever send pieces of lace through the post, Mr. Gray? Gifts, tokens?" Gray blinked, surprised into honesty. "Occasionally. To patrons of her charities, to a vicar's wife enamoured of old things. She called it her discipline of beauty, but of late, no."
"She kept it close," Inspector Crail stood.
"You will all remain available. I should like a word alone with Miss Marple." They departed, some with backward glances, as if the room itself might accuse them of theft. The door closed.
Rain began again, light as breath on glass. Crail leaned both hands on the desk.
"Well?" Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "We must have the port bottle analysed, of course, though I suspect it will tell us life's usual tale, that the thing that kills is not always where we expect to find it. You think the lace itself?"
"I think," Miss Marple said, "of an old advertisement I once saw for a face powder.
It promised a lady would be admired even in her coffin. They used arsenic in such thing, or to whiten, to preserve. A terrible vanity. In households where lace is a religion, women have been known to stiffen it with preparations not meant for mouths.
And yet, arsenic is also humble.
One finds it in old cupboards, in rat pastes, in papers, meant to preserve specimens. Crail's scepticism did not quite reach his eyes.
Even so, how did it enter the wine?
Miss Marple tilted her head.
Capillarity is a sly servant.
A lace soaked in a solution or dusted with a residue placed over a liquid. The fibres draw, the liquid rises. A kiss at the rim is enough. The port, being so dear and dark, would disguise a strange bitterness. Crail's jaw worked. A murder by geometry. By domestic science, Miss Marple corrected mildly, and by memory. Whoever did this knew her ladyship would play the coquette and veil her glass, and how could anyone rely on that? Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the window, where the garden made an etching against grey.
Because, Inspector, she had done it before, Crail stared. You think this was a ritual? Not quite, Miss Marple said.
A habit. Perhaps the victim of a jest in youth, a dashing gentleman who taught her to lend lace to wine, a maiden aunt who told her ladies veil the things men drink from. It is the cruelest sort of trap, one built from the victim's own vanity. Crail ran a hand down his face. Very well. We'll test the lace and the rest in that cursed sewing room. He paused. Who then? The butler who knows the household like a map. The niece who benefits by the new will not being signed. The colonel who despises poison but might still carry it. Mrs. Whitfield who peddles rumours like sugared almonds. Or this ghost writer, the dead man who sends letters. Let us not forget Mr. Gray, Miss Marple said. Solicitors are rarely guilty in real life, which is precisely why it is so charming to suspect them. Crail gave a laugh as dry as a file. You'll have your interviews by your fashion then. By the hearth, with jam, if you please, Miss Marple said, the corners of her mouth not quite smiling. People speak more truthfully when there is something sweet to do with their hands. The day withdrew a little further, as if the sky had taken 2 steps back from the earth. Miss Marple, drawing the study's lamp lower, arranged cups and saucers on a small table near the fire. The kettle hissed. She placed her shawl about her shoulders. An old moth had ornamented one corner with sincerity, and beckoned first Mr. Hargreaves to sit. He perched warily, like a bird on a wire. Sugar? Miss Marple asked. No, ma'am. Ah, she said, as if that too meant something. This house has been under your hand a long time, Mr. Hargreaves. 31 years, he said, the number a small pride.
I came under the late Sir Alistair. I've closed a good many doors since, and opened many, Miss Marple said. Tell me, the sewing room.
Who had keys?
Her ladyship and I, he said.
The seamstress when she came by appointment. Miss Beatrice had the run of the house, of course, but she rarely entered there. Said the smell of camphor gave her a headache. Camphor, Miss Marple repeated, as if testing the scent on memory.
And nothing stronger?
Hargreaves blinked. We keep moth papers, ma'am. Some years ago there was talk of arsenical preparations for preserving silks, but I would not allow it. We had one accident long ago, and it soured me on such things. Long ago, Miss Marple said. The death of Miss Winmere's mother. Hargreaves' face tightened, then smoothed. I am not at liberty to philosophize, ma'am. Nor I to insist, Miss Marple replied. You have served long. In such service one sometimes becomes
family, he swallowed, and a little of the angle left his shoulders.
Her ladyship was generous to me in her way, and to Miss Beatrice she was cruel.
I have no other remark to make. None is required, Miss Marple said,
and poured him tea, which he did not drink. When he had gone, she asked Mrs. Whitfield to sit. Mrs. Whitfield took 2 sugars and a scone and confided, as women do when their hands are busy, that Lady Agatha had made an enemy in the most trifling of ways a fortnight past. She had refused a subscription to the parish's lacework bazaar, but sent, oh irony, a single antique handkerchief instead, with a note that said, "Sell this if you can. Truth fetches a price." Truth, Miss Marple murmured.
Mrs. Whitfield, forgive a personal question. Do you owe money?
The violet perfume trembled. My late husband, dear Mrs. Marple, left me with more regrets than securities. A brittle smile, but regret dresses better. And who in this house dresses worst? Miss Marple asked gently. Mrs. Whitfield's gaze darted toward the door, toward the past. Hargreaves is proud poor. Mr. Grey is modest rich. The Colonel is bluff and brass. And Beatrice is starving, but it is not her purse that suffers. What is it then? Forgiveness, Mrs. Whitfield said so softly it might have been the fire speaking. She has been hungry for it since she was a girl. Next came Colonel Denton, who refused a scone and took tea without milk. Blast it, Miss Marple, he began. You have that look of a general who intends to take a hill I cannot even see. There are hills. Colonel, Miss Marple said, that are only visible in certain weather. He huffed, but the corners of his mouth softened. Ask your questions. Did Lady Agatha fear anyone? Miss Marple asked. Not in the way sensible people fear dogs or debt, Denton said, but she feared time. That is why she hoarded lace. Old, beautiful things that prove one can catch time and fold it away. And you? Miss Marple asked gently. What do you fear? He hesitated, the soldier suddenly a man. Uselessness, he said at last. And seeing young people do harm to themselves and calling it justice. Miss Marple poured his tea and evaded no eyes. And watch over Miss Beatrice, Colonel. Not with noise, but with notice. He left, awkwardly grateful. And the room grew quiet enough to hear the clock change its mind. Mr. Grey took his place with the air of a man who has practised innocence and finds it fits. He accepted jam with punctilious thanks and said, even before she asked, I did not touch the decanter.
I did not touch the lace.
I did not advise Lady Winmere to postpone her signature. I wished it done, and if it had been done, Miss Marple said mildly, your position would be
unchanged. He looked at her, surprised again into honesty.
I am a salaried man, Mrs. Marple. People imagine we lawyers grow fat on codicils and cruelty.
In truth, we grow tired.
The changes in that will were old battles.
Only one thing was new, and that was...
Grey's eyes cooled. A bequest to someone not in the family. A name I had not seen in her affairs before. Lady Winmere said only, payment for an old debt. Mr. Grey, some things are not to be sold. When I asked who the person was, she said, a child who was never a child. Miss Marple felt the smallest shiver under her shawl.
And the name?
I was not permitted to copy it, Grey said. She wrote it on a separate sheet and kept it with her, in her reticule, I believe, which is now, Crail interjected. Grim, missing, Grey spread his hands. Then your mystery is not only who killed her, Inspector, but who took the child from paper back into shadow. Miss Marple thanked him and let him go, and when the door had closed, she sat very still until the lamp made a little sound like a sigh. Evening sloped across the panes, thin and blue as watered silk. Miss Marple asked for the lace boxes to be brought from the sewing room. Under Crail's watchful eye and the housemaid's awed silence, she examined them as a priestess might examine relics. She did not touch with fingers, but with the corner of her shawl. Some pieces were crisp with age. Some slept in the softness of disuse.
On three, only three, a faint dust lay like snow that had not melted.
She saw, too, within the bottom of one box, a small envelope that had evaded anxious tidying, a stamped card from a chemical supplier in Bath, dated 6 months prior, with the most innocuous line, "Arsenical moth papers enclosed as requested. Caution to be used in storage of fine textiles," Inspector Crail swore under his breath. "There's our route." Miss Marple looked up at him. "A route is not a destination, Inspector."
Who ordered them?
He signalled Hargreaves, who studied the card as if it might bite.
Not I, he said, offended. I should not suffer such things to be used. Lady Windermere?
Crail prompted. "Possibly, sir," Hargreaves conceded after a difficult swallow. She allowed no insect to threaten her treasures. "But they were not in my ledger." "Then someone intended them to be seen by no one," Miss Marple said softly. "Except the lace." She chose the 3 dusted pieces and laid them on the desk beneath the lamp, their patterns delicate as frost on a church window. Beside them the handkerchief from last night, pale ivory stained now with an ugly bloom. The room smelled faintly of camphor, of damp wool, of something bitter that memory had not yet named. "Send these to the laboratory," Crail ordered, and a constable carried them away like fragile gilt. Miss Marple, left with the silence, drew the wick of the lamp lower yet. She remained there, alone for a time, while the house settled and doors counted the hours with their hinges. She let the room speak. It did so in sighs, in little remembrances, a child's hand. A letter from the dead.
A will unsigned.
A lace coquette's gesture. She thought of Beatrice, of grief refined and frozen into manners, of Hargreaves loyal as a spine, of the Colonel's blunt gallantry, of Mrs. Whitfield's perfumed hunger, of Mr. Grey's careful neutrality. She thought of Lady Agatha, who had liked to trap time and make of it a pet. Time which, like any wild thing, turns when the leash is drawn too tight. The candle on the desk, a practical stub in a brass holder, was burning down. Miss Marple, with a small movement that was almost a caress, cupped its flame to shield it from a draught, and allowed herself one admission that in the quiet at the heart of all puzzles lies something that is not logic, but sorrow. It was that made her persist.
A footstep at the door.
Beatrice stood there, not entering. She seemed, in that lamplight, more shadow than girl. "Miss Marple," she said. "May I speak?" "Of course, child." Miss Marple did not say child with diminishment, but with shelter. Beatrice came to the chair opposite and sat with her hands tight around a small object. She placed it on the desk without ceremony. It was a brooch, a tiny silver filigree in the shape of a rose. "My mother's," she said. "I found it this morning in my aunt's writing desk." She had no right to it. Miss Marple looked at the brooch and saw not a flower, but a memory pinned to a bodice. "You are angry?" she said. "Yes," Beatrice said simply. "I am angry that she kept everything that made us bleed." Miss Marple regarded her with quiet steadiness. "You do not ask me if I think you killed her?" "No." "Why?"
"Because you would tell me the truth," Beatrice said.
"And the truth is that you do not yet know." She rose then, quickly, as if words had burned her. "Find out," she said. "Please find out." When she had gone, Miss Marple sat a long while, hearing in the candle's finger of flame the tremulous breathing of an idea not yet born. She put out her hand for her handbag, meaning to return home, and her fingers brushed something folded and familiar, the scrap of lace she had taken from the sewing room that afternoon. She drew it out and held it to the light. There, faint and wicked as spider's milk, was the sheen of a powder. She touched the lace to the brass rim of the candlestick and watched, in the tiniest of experiments, how the flame wavered as a breath of bitterness rose. Not sweet at all, she thought, not sweet. She replaced the lace, gathered her shawl and stood. On the desk, the tray of correspondence lay as it had all day, letters bundled, the paper knife a swan, the envelopes restful. Yet now, to Miss Marple's eye, something was shifted, subtler than a hair. She went forward, peered, and very gently lifted the topmost bundle. Beneath it, hidden in courtesy rather than art, lay an envelope with its flap torn away. The hand on its front was round, careful, laboriously neat to Lady Agatha Winmere. The ink had blotted in one place, as little hands do when the pen hesitates. She drew the single sheet from within. The letter was brief.
I am told not to write.
But I am not dead.
You must stop.
If you do not stop, I shall come to your house and make you stop. Do not write again to Mr. The name was torn away with the flap. Miss Marple's breath left her as a candle gives a last tremble. She held the torn edge against the missing flap and saw that the rip was recent, clean as a surgeon's work. Someone had read this letter today and taken the name away. Her mind moved as quickly as the clock's second hand. Who had had cause and opportunity to unname the letter's ghost? Who had been alone in this room long enough to choose one envelope among many, to slide a paper knife cleanly through a line that mattered? Behind her, the door opened very softly, and a voice said, courteous and colourless, "Forgive me, Miss Marple. I left my gloves upon the shelf." Mr. Gray glided in with the grace of a man who had often removed himself from rooms without leaving footprints. He smiled, noting her posture by the desk, the letter in her hand.
Ah, correspondence. Lady Winmere kept such a museum of it. Miss Marple returned the smile that is only roof to the house of thoughts. Indeed, do you always wear gloves, Mr. Gray?
He glanced down at his hands, ungloved, and his mouth made a line. Not always. When you touched this letter today, Miss Marple said, very mild, did you wear them then? For a heartbeat, something fierce and small swam across his face, a fish beneath lace. Then it was gone. He inclined his head. I did not touch any letter, Mrs. Marple. I was never alone in this room. Then I am mistaken, Miss Marple murmured, and slid the letter back into its envelope. She noted, without looking, the tiny oak leaf of a watermark in the paper. She had seen that leaf somewhere else today. Where? Gray retrieved his gloves from the shelf and glanced at the candlestick, at the scrap of lace near it, at the brooch Beatrice had left. He was a man who saw much and advertised nothing. I should advise for your own safety that you do not handle anything. Untreated, he said. Untreated, Miss Marple repeated, tasting the word. Such as lace? Such as secrets, Gray said, and bowed himself out. Miss Marple stood very still until his footfalls joined the house's chorus, and then faded. She lifted the letter again and studied the watermark closely.
An oak leaf.
It had adorned not the papers of the study, but one of the boxes in the sewing room, a maker's mark embossed upon the inner lid, a bath stationer perhaps, used long ago to store. She turned to go, caught sight of the small tray that had held the port the night before, and noticed, at last, a faint line along its edge where a glass had been set down and then moved. There, preserved in a thin kiss of wine, was a print of a pattern, not of a thumb or lip, but of lace itself pressed wet upon the metal. She bent close. The pattern was distinctive, roses entwined with thorns, Lady Agatha's handkerchief, but also, perhaps, a twin. 2 handkerchiefs, thought Miss Marple, the idea flaring at last into light. One known, one prepared. A switch made easy by darkness and a houseful of watchers watching the wrong hands. She straightened, heart like a small bird against a window. Outside the rain had stopped. The air was sharp and clean, as if the world had been washed and hung up to dry. The puzzle, newly lit from within, still lacked one thread. Who had made the switch? Who had known the habit and governed the moment? Who had reason to keep a will unsigned and a name torn away? Miss Marple went to the door, pausing only to take the little silver rose Beatrice had left. She closed her fingers about it until its fine edges pressed against her palm and made a pain that felt like truth. Tomorrow would bring more questions. And tonight would bring the quiet in which truths make themselves ready. But before she departed, she did one last small thing. She blew out the candle on the desk and watched the smoke climb, thin and blue, into the late afternoon air. It coiled and wrote an invisible word she had seen written before. In many houses, by many hands, forgive. She put on her coat, drew her shawl close and stepped into the corridor, where the house, bereaved and stubborn, kept breathing. At the threshold, she met Inspector Crail, who had the look of a man who holds his theory as one holds a cat that does not like to be held. "We've our lab man," he said. "He'll tell us by morning whether your lace is murder or moth-proof." "Both," Miss Marple said, and smiled just a little.
"And Inspector, I keep an eye on Mr. Gray's hands."
"He's very careful with them," Crail frowned. "Because he writes?" "Because he does not wish to be written upon," Miss Marple said, and went out into the evening, where the village had lit its lamps and the mist had wandered away from the hedges, like a guest whose departure no one had the heart to remark. At home, by her own hearth, Miss Marple made tea and allowed the kettle's song to untie the knot in her chest. She placed the scrap of lace on a saucer and set it by the window where the last light could search it. From a drawer she took an old book of household remedies, its pages foxed and dear, and turned to a receipt she had once copied from a neighbour who wanted her curtains whitened past reason. "A solution of arsenical soap," it read, "is commonly used by taxidermists and foolish housekeepers." She closed the book and thought of Lady Agatha, preserving lace as if preserving history's pale throat. Some preservations are merely rehearsals for death. She lit a small candle, not for theatrics, but because she had always preferred light that confessed itself, and sat in its circle, thinking of a child who wrote round letters, of a mother who died, of a niece who did not eat sugar,
Of a butler who would not permit certain things.
of a solicitor who handled words as if they were instruments, of a colonel who hated poison because it ambiguates courage, and of a widow who needed banknotes to keep perfume from becoming poverty. The flame made a delicate ladder of gold upon the window pane. Somewhere, a fox barked once in the darkening lane. Miss Marple's thoughts climbed the ladder and looked down upon the pattern that had been laid. She could see, just faintly, the outline of the hand that had woven it. Not yet the face, but the posture, the angle of a pride, the contour of an old grievance. When at last she went to bed, she left the candle burning a little longer, a watchman over lace and letters. And just before she slept, she remembered with a small start where she had seen the oak leaf watermark before. It was not only in the sewing room, it was on a bundle of legal foolscap earlier that afternoon, beneath Mr. Gray's hand. She slept then, with that leaf fallen upon the floor of her mind, waiting to be swept into the hearth of morning. And the house at Windermere Lodge, if houses dream, dreamed of hands that folded, of threads that tightened, and of a glass lifted beneath a veil that was not meant to save. Chapter. Morning arrived as if poured from pewter, slow, cold, and precise. Mist lingered low over St. Mary Mead, and the hedgerows were strung with webs like pale embroidery. Miss Marple, who had slept with the lightest thread of an idea glimmering in her mind, woke early, boiled water in her little blue kettle, and wrote 3 notes in a tidy hand. One she addressed to Inspector Crail, one to the vicar's wife, and one to Miss Beatrice Windermere at Windermere Lodge. She sealed them with a fierce little pressure of her thumb, not out of superstition, but because in a world where so much was uncertain, one must make the small gestures count. By 10 o'clock she was walking up the elms to Windermere Lodge. The house stood in that hush peculiar to great rooms after a death, the hush of clocks that will not be hurried. A constable nodded her through. She found Inspector Crail in the morning room, reading a typed report as if it had personally offended him. "Laboratory," he said, tapping the page. "Traces of arsenic in the lace handkerchief from last night. The other 2 pieces from the sewing room carry residue as well, stronger on the edges where lace meets lips. The port is clean." Your hypothesis holds. Miss Marple made no show of triumph.
And the decanter? Untouched.
We'll keep it for the Crown, he said dryly, and placed the report aside. You've been busy with your notes. I have asked Mrs. Alderton at the post office if she recalls any unusual commissions or deliveries last week, Miss Marple said, removing her gloves. And I've asked the vicar's wife to call on Mrs. Whitfield. A grief shared over teacups will often spill the teaspoon. Crail gave her a sideways look. And the note to Miss Windermere? A kindness, Miss Marple said, with a question knotted into it. He didn't press. It was one of the curious mercies of Inspector Crail that for all his granite manner, he could sometimes perceive where a gentlewoman's privacy was not an indulgence but a tool. Before we begin today, he said, Hargreaves asked to speak. Claims to have a clarification. Miss Marple's eyes moved to the window where the garden made a pale anatomy of itself. Clarifications have a way of being confessions that forgot to be brave. Hargreaves entered as one who has rehearsed a bow to the gallows. His face was strained and peculiarly young along the mouth, when the rest of it had long since become old wood. Inspector, he said. Miss Marple. He stood just inside the room, hands folded like a chapel carving.
I beg to amend my statement of yesterday. Crail's pen hovered. Amend away, Hargreaves swallowed.
The arsenical papers for the lace. The order. 6 months ago, I said I would not allow it. That was not entirely true.
I did not originate the order.
But Lady Windermere placed the pages herself in my hand. She had been advised by some needlewoman in Bath, she said, that such papers would deter moth and brighten yellowed thread. I protested. She laughed. He looked at the far wall. Her ladyship did not enjoy being contradicted. I had the parcel delivered to the back entrance and placed it in her sewing room per her instruction.
I never handled the lace with my bare hands after that day. Did anyone else?
Crail asked. Her ladyship, of course.
And he hesitated.
Miss Whitfield visited that room twice last week. She has a taste for old things. Said it made her feel less modern. Crail made a note.
Why did you omit this?
Hargreaves's jaw set. I have served here a long time.
I have done foolish things out of loyalty.
That is all. Miss Marple's voice was as gentle as the breath a window leaves on winter glass. Loyalty to whom, Mr. Hargreaves? To the house? To Lady Agatha? Or to someone else? He stared at her, the brittle dignity flickering. For an instant, something like a wound showed through. Then the mask slid back. To the name on the plate by the gate, he said, and bowed himself out. Crail shut his notebook with an unlovely sound. We'll speak with Mrs. Whitfield again. I dislike what arsenic does to lace.
I dislike even more what it does to stories. Arsenic simplifies stories, Miss Marple said softly.
It turns many shades of grey into two, before and after. He did not ask her whether she spoke of murders or of motives. Miss Marple asked that the sewing room be opened again. The air inside was cool, with that slight chalky breath that clings to old papers.
Lace lay in its boxes, some like coiled snowdrifts, some like thin moonlight.
She went to the shelf where she had first found the half-hidden parcel. The lower boxes were labelled in Lady Agatha's tidy hand, Bruges, Honiton, Rose Point. On the highest shelf, hard to reach without a chair, was a box of no great size, marked only with an inked oak leaf. The sight gave Miss Marple a prickle, not of fear, but of recognition. She drew the chair gently with her foot,
mounted it one step, and brought the box down with both hands.
The lid made a soft sound as it parted. Inside lay not lace but papers, small envelopes, folded notes, oddments of correspondence. Each had been trimmed, clipped, or bound with a thin green ribbon. On the underside of the lid, impressed in the card, was the watermark she had seen upon yesterday's torn letter, and on a sheaf that had sat beneath Mr. Gray's left hand. An oak leaf, Bath, she murmured.
A stationer, Crail peered over.
You think Lady Windermere bought her correspondence box from the same man who sells Mr. Gray his fool's cap?
I think, Miss Marple said,
that Lady Windermere purchased a great many things from Bath. It is a city that encourages the collecting of trifles and regrets. She set aside a fat bundle of letters from the year of the coronation and found, toward the bottom, a smaller packet. 4 notes written on the same oak leaf paper, bound with ribbon and labelled in that neat script, "Child." Her breath went still. She loosed the ribbon and unfolded the first. The handwriting was the same labouring.
Round hand as the letter from the dead. The message was brief and aching with effort. Dear Lady Windermere, I am not a beggar. Please do not send money. I only want my name.
They say it is not a good name, but it is mine. You may keep the rest. I am told I ought to be grateful.
I am grateful to know where I came from. I was a child, but I was not allowed to be one. I can be a gardener even with a bad name. I will not write again if you ask me not to. The second and third letters were similar.
A child to man writing on the edge of dignity, offering nothing, asking for very little. The last was newer. The hand had steadied. You wrote to Mr. Do not write again. This is my boundary. If you cross it, I will come and make you stop. You are not the only person who can keep lace. I too can keep a thing.
I keep my own life.
There was no surname. The torn flap of yesterday's letter would have held it. Preserved, perhaps, in some careful pocket. Miss Marple replaced the letters and shut the box. A child who was never a child. The phrase had not been a poet's whim. It was a label in a dead woman's hand, tied with ribbon and put upon a high shelf. Inspector, she said very quietly, we must find Lady Agatha's reticule. We've turned the house thrice, Crail replied. It is not here. It is, Miss Marple said. It is somewhere a widow would think to tidy, a butler would not dare to disturb, and a solicitor would not notice because he is too sensible to touch ornaments. She turned slowly, her gaze passing over work table, wardrobe, chaise, hearth, and then to the piano in the drawing-room beyond the open door, upon which a lace cloth still lay, as if dignity could be arranged out of thin thread. She crossed to it at once. The lace that had been flung here on the night of the death still lay, slightly disordered, as if a hand had drawn across it, and not quite smoothed it back. Beneath, the piano lid had been lowered. Beneath that, the music stand had been slid forward by a fraction, as if perhaps someone had tucked something flat and small beneath. Miss Marple's fingers went deftly to the place where a gentlewoman might hide a letter from sight without losing it over the keys. Her hand emerged a moment later with a soft, worn bag of black silk, clasped with a jet button. It was Lady Agatha's reticule. Crail let out a breath he had not meant to hold.
By heavens, Miss Marple did not open it immediately.
She always observed a small silence before reading the dead. Then she undid the clasp and looked inside. A tiny silver pencil, a slender bottle of smelling salts,
a thin notepaper folded twice,
and a heavier sheet folded once of that same oak leaf paper. She removed the heavier sheet first. It was headed, in Lady Agatha's hand, Codicil to my will, draft, to be copied by Mr. Gray upon my approval. Beneath, in the same hand, one sentence, to the sum of £2,000,
as an acknowledgment of debts owed to a child who was never a child.
The blank was not blank in ink. There had been a name. The name had been cut away with a neat blade, the edges crisp where it had been excised. Mr. Gray's paper knife, swan-necked and elegant, could have done it in one flexing motion. Miss Marple took up the lighter, folded note. It was addressed to Mr. Gray. In a hard, small script, Lady Agatha had written, I will not be dissuaded. He deserves this. If you wish to remove your services, do so. You cannot remove my intention. Miss Marple replaced both sheets, shut the reticule, and with that little ceremonial gravity that was hers alone, set it on the piano as if she had just returned a lady to a seat. Whoever tore that name, Crail said hoarsely, did so after the death, or just before, Miss Marple said. We should arrest Gray, Crail snapped, then checked himself.
I'll not do it without more. No, Miss Marple agreed, eyes far away.
Not yet. Mrs. Alderton, the postmistress, arrived at the lodge with a brisk nod and pink cheeks. She had that useful village gift of remembering who bought envelopes on Tuesdays. Miss Marple drew her aside to the small morning parlour and provided a wedge of seed cake which, in St. Mary Mead, Was currency more reliable than sterling? Last week, Miss Marple began.
Any unusual post handled for Windmere Lodge? 2 parcels, Mrs. Alderton said.
One from Bath, very light, like paper. Mr. Hargreaves signed. And a boy brought a letter to be sent. Not from the house, mind you, but he said as how it must go to Lady Windmere. Strictly private.
Paid in coins, bless his boots, a boy.
From the charity school, Mrs. Alderton nodded. The kind with clean ears and mended sleeves, well spoken. He'd rehearsed what he was to say, if you ask me. Did he give a name?
No name, she said smartly.
But he left his thumbprint in the gum. She coloured, laughed.
I do not mean to say I keep such things, Mrs. Marple. Only I notice.
It had ink on it. He'd been addressing something and blotted his fingers. An oak leaf? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Alderton's eyes widened.
Yes, how did you—
Miss Marple only patted her hand. Thank you, dear Mrs. Alderton. You have been a trump. When the woman had gone, Miss Marple stood in the little room, letting the speech of all these tidings make its pattern.
Oak leaf paper. A boy running errands.
A codicil naming a child who was never a child. A torn name. She thought, too, of last night's tiny print of lace on the port-tray. The twin handkerchiefs, the controlled cruelty of a switch, made in darkness. She turned and found Beatrice at the doorway, pale and self-possessed as if she had been folded and pressed all night in a book of manners. You wrote to me, Beatrice said.
You asked me if my mother ever told me anything. Untoward, Miss Marple nodded.
It was a delicate question. I shall give you a delicate answer, and you will know what I mean, Beatrice said with a courage that made her very beautiful. The night before she died, when I was a child, with plaits and premature carefulness, my mother sat beside my bed and told me that she was going away. She said that when ladies go away, they leave lace behind them. She pressed a handkerchief into my hand, a rose pattern, ivory, like ice one can wear. She told me to love the lace and despise no one, not even the person who had taught the lace to lie. Miss Marple felt something cool and bright move along her spine, like the first breeze after heat.
Beatrice.
Did you keep that handkerchief?
For years, Beatrice said.
Then one day my aunt took it from my trunk and said I mustn't brood. She said lace is only pretty when it is on display. She hung it beside her own on a screen in the sewing room. Beatrice's eyes drifted.
I saw it yesterday after the thing.
It was not there. Ah, Miss Marple breathed. That is very helpful. It is everything I have, Beatrice said. Then with a sudden change of tone, like a cloud crossing over sun, I hated her, Miss Marple.
I hated what she made of the air in this house.
But I did not poison her.
I could not have borne— She stopped, and in that stopping said more than a confession would have. Miss Marple took Beatrice's cold hand for a brief, firm moment.
I believe you. Beatrice's composure quivered into gratitude and reformed itself. She departed like a woman who will not be seen to stumble within a house that already watches too closely. Colonel Denton's heavy tread came later,
marching up to indignation and then remembering to salute the dead.
He was for once subdued. Came to see if I might be of use, he said awkwardly. I find I don't much like my own company in a case like this. Your company will be much required very soon, Miss Marple replied.
You were a soldier.
You understand the mechanics of a briefing, eh? I shall be asking you, Colonel, to keep your temper where I cannot keep it for you, and to watch hands more than faces, he blustered, as men do when they are moved. Well then, yes, good. Point me at a trench. When the time comes, Miss Marple said, and smiled kindly. For now, will you do a small errand? Step into the solicitor's office, ask Mr. Gray whether he might attend the lodge at 8 this evening, and observe his hands when you ask. It is a trifling thing, but sometimes trifles are heavy. You want to see if he reaches for his gloves? If he reaches for anything, Miss Marple said. The Colonel went, and time lengthened. In its length, Mrs. Whitfield fluttered back as if blown by a sentimental breeze. Her eyes were rimmed with pink, and her violet perfume slightly faded, like a treat one cannot afford to replace. I am here to comfort, if I can, she announced to the air, her glance slipping over Miss Marple and towards the foyer, as if comfort were a matter of being seen delivering it. Comfort often begins with confession, Miss Marple said brightly. "Do sit, Mrs. Whitfield. I have been thinking of you in the sewing room with the lace." Mrs. Whitfield sat so rapidly her hat wobbled. "I simply admired it," she said. "Who would not? Lace is the only frivolity that makes virtue look at itself and pretend to be delicate. And you handled it?" Miss Marple smiled as though discussing the parlour ferns. "I touched it," Mrs. Whitfield said, defensive. "Agatha kept me waiting for a half-hour like a tradesman. When she came in, I was standing at the table holding a piece up to the light. 'My dear,' I said, 'this is snow.' She slapped it out of my hand. The cruelty of the woman. Which piece did you hold?" Miss Marple asked. "The handkerchief with the roses," Mrs. Whitfield said at once, then faltered. "Or the other one?"
They look alike.
"I have a talent with old things, Mrs. Marple, but not clairvoyance in the dark. Did you know that arsenic will cling to lace more ardently where the thread has been stiffened with sugar water?" Miss Marple asked mildly. "Some housekeepers used to make what they called sweetened size. It made the edges hold up beautifully." Mrs. Whitfield paled, an unbecoming white beneath her rouge.
I do not bake sugar into my mittens, if that is what you suggest." "No," Miss Marple said, and the kindness in her tone was like cool water.
"I mean only that lace takes what it is given and holds it. Houses do too." Mrs. Whitfield left in a hurry then, and Miss Marple was glad of it. There are kinds of hunger one does not feed with questions. They devour themselves well enough. By mid-afternoon, the house had shifted from mourning to that peculiar fuss that attends an impending reckoning. Crail came in from the lane with a thin satisfaction in his jaw. "Colonel did as asked," he said. Grey agreed to 8 o'clock. He reached for his gloves before the sentence was out of the Colonel's mouth and then withdrew his hand without taking them. "A man who corrects himself halfway through a reflex," Miss Marple inclined her head. "He took the name from Lady Agatha's codicil. He may have done it from self-interest. He may have done it from a solicitor's reflex to keep scandal from becoming public property. In either case, it tells us he knows the name, and the name is—" "I will not speak it until I can prove it," Miss Marple said quietly, "but I will offer you the shape of it. It begins with T. It was a child's initial once, which became a man's initial, whom Lady Agatha wrote to and threatened with the old power she liked to think she owned." Crail's eyes narrowed. "Threatened with what?" "Exposure," Miss Marple said. "Of course. She played with lives as she played with lace, cutting and joining where it pleased her. She wrote to a man about his parentage. He refused her, not her money, but her naming. He wrote to Mr. Grey and to Lady Agatha to stop. He sent a boy because he is not a fool in a small place. He knows who sees whom at the counter. He may be a gardener. He may be a labourer. He may be in this very house, dressed in black and called by a title that is not his own name." Crail stared.
"You think—" Miss Marple's gaze did not flinch.
"I think, Inspector, that the child who was never a child is a man we have all addressed as Mr. for so long that we have forgotten how young he must once have been when he first learned to say yes."
"Madam instead of yes, mother." Crail's breath made a sound.
"Hargreaves. Who else?" Miss Marple said, very gently, "has the keys to the lace, the knowledge of Lady Agatha's little theatricals, the opportunity to handle a twin handkerchief, the pride to refuse money and demand only a name?" Crail swore softly. "He would be more likely to tear the name out of a codicil than to keep it, prefer shame to charity. And yet," Miss Marple added, "ask yourself whether he poisoned her." Crail's jaw worked.
"I am not sure."
"If he did it not for money, but against being bought. But it is ugly, Miss Marple, to suspect a man like that." "It is uglier still to be a child who must never be a child," Miss Marple said. "But we are not at the end of our lace. There is one thread more." She went back to the drawing-room, to the portrait she had studied yesterday. She took from her handbag the silver rose brooch Beatrice had left, just for a moment, weighing it in her palm, and then set it down again. From her reticule she drew the scrap of lace she had removed the day before. She held it over the tray, close to the faint wine ghost of the pattern. The threads matched like lips to a kiss. "This," she said softly, "is the sister to the handkerchief that killed." Crail bent. "Then who brought this sister to the table?" "Someone who had no reason to fear lace. Miss Marple said. Someone who believed lace's armour, as Hargreaves said. The one person who could walk about this house with a piece of Lady Agatha's property and excite no alarm, Beatrice, Crail said. Grim, or Hargreaves, Miss Marple returned, or Mrs. Whitfield, who had been allowed to admire it, or Mr. Gray, who no one notices touching paper. She straightened. At 8 o'clock, Inspector, I should like to ask that you gather them all in the drawing-room. I shall require the port decanter, 6 glasses, the 2 remaining lace handkerchiefs from the sewing-room, the letter packet labelled child, and the piano. The piano? A little music steadies a confession, Miss Marple said, her smile like a hidden pin. And I will ask the Colonel to play God Save the King very softly at a certain moment. Crail blinked. You mean to make a show of it? I mean to make a pattern visible, Miss Marple said. When the pattern is seen, the thing itself will confess. He looked at her then, truly looked, as if seeing not a kindly spinster, but the stern seamstress of truth. You're certain, he said, low. I am certain of the how, she answered, in the calm tone of a woman setting down a teacup on a saucer that will not rattle, and nearly certain of the who. The letter will give me the final knot. What letter? The one Mr. Gray carries in his pocket, she said. The torn flap with the name upon it. He cannot have thrown it away, any more than a careful man throws away the lid of his box. He will think it safer upon his person until matters settle. They will settle tonight. Crail, to his credit, did not argue. He only squared his shoulders. 8 o'clock then, Miss Marple nodded. 8, and Inspector, and if I falter, you will clip the thread. He gave a short, grave bow. Before evening, Miss Marple returned once to her cottage. She sat with a candle and allowed herself a brief inward sinking, not of despair, but of recollection. A child's round hand. A woman who believed lace could refine brutality into decorum. A butler who learned, very young, to be called by a name that was not kin. She thought of her own childhood, of a governess who would say, "We must learn to do without many things, Jane, comfort, sugar, and unearned forgiveness." She smiled a little at that. One learns the most useful lessons against one's will. She took from her drawer a small bottle labelled vinegar of roses and a length of plain cotton. She damped the cotton, pressed it to the lace she had carried, watched the faintest cloud rise upon the cloth, not to test the chemistry, she believed, the laboratory, but because the act steadied her. This is not magic, she told herself. It is patience. It is watching a stain lift to the surface. By 7:30, she was back at Windermere Lodge. The drawing-room had been lit with lamps turned low, so that the silver on the tray might glance and be seen. The piano stood open. The lace handkerchiefs lay folded upon a sable cloth. Inspector Crail, the blunt instrument sharpened by necessity, waited by the mantel. The Colonel stood near the piano, hands hovering over the keys with a soldier's awkwardness about music. Mrs. Whitfield trembled prettily in a chair. Beatrice, pale as knowledge, stood near the fire. Mr. Hargreaves took his station like a piece of furniture that had chosen to have opinions. Mr. Gray arrived with punctilious apology and gloves in his pocket, but not upon his hands.
Miss Marple took her place by the tray. A modest woman about to pour tea. "My friends," she said, and the word friends did not flatter.
It merely bound them to the courtesy of the moment. "We are here to remove a veil. It is not a long veil. It is very thin. We must do it together." No one breathed. "Lady Agatha Windermere was killed by arsenic transferred into her wine through lace," she began, her voice mild as a Sunday afternoon. "The poison resided not in the port, but in the handkerchief she placed over her glass. This gesture was a small vanity of hers, one she had practiced before in the theatricals of her dinners. Someone prepared a twin handkerchief and contrived that Lady Agatha would pick up the wrong one at the right moment. The flicker of the candles assisted. So did our natural inclination to look at faces rather than at the quiet
"Hands that arrange our doom, Mr. Gray's."
Fingers twitched. The lace last night carried arsenic, because arsenical moth papers had been ordered to preserve the collection. Mr. Hargreaves speaks the truth in two halves. He opposed the practice, and yet carried it out by his duty. Miss Marple inclined her head towards him, and something like a grateful fury moved over his features. The residue clung to several pieces, but the lethal dose was concentrated on a particular handkerchief. That requires intent, knowledge, access. She turned her head slightly to Beatrice. It also requires someone who knew the handkerchief that belonged to Beatrice's mother. A ripple,
soft and horrified, went through the room. "My mother's," Beatrice whispered.
then closed her mouth and stood straighter. There were 2 rose-pattern handkerchiefs in the sewing room, Miss Marple went on. One had belonged to Lady Agatha, the other to her sister, Beatrice's mother. The second vanished yesterday. The pattern left faintly in dried port upon the tray shows us that the twin was present last night, kissed to the metal before a glass was lifted. Thus, when Lady Agatha, in her coquette's fashion, drew lace across the rim, she did so with a piece of another woman's past pressed against her lips. Miss Marple's eyes had not left Mr. Grey's face. "We will come in a moment." To which hands made that exchange? First, why? Silence gathered like fog. Lady Agatha had determined to sign a codicil, Miss Marple said. It was found in her reticule, hidden beneath the piano's lace. The codicil left a sum to a person she called a child who was never a child. The name was cut away with a paper knife sometime between her writing and our discovery. Mr. Grey. All eyes turned. Mr. Grey's face did not redden. It paled. You removed that name. Grey's composure, which had served him through deaths and debts in every parish within 20 miles, cracked like ice on a bucket.
He swallowed.
Then, with a weary gentleman's courage, yes, I did, but not to shield murder, to shield a life from a public blot. She intended to name a man who has made of his disgrace a discipline. It was not my right, as a solicitor, to permit a dead woman to claim a living man for her reputation's sake. Crail took one step. Name. Grey's hand went, not to his pocket, but to the inner fold of his coat, and emerged with a small folded scrap, the flap torn from the letter. He held it as one holds a communion wafer that one does not believe in and fears to drop. I did not destroy it, he said.
I could not. Here. Crail took the scrap.
Miss Marple took the letter from the oak leaf box. She fitted flap to tear. The name stood there, plain as dawn, dark as history. Thomas Hargreaves. No one spoke. The house itself perhaps made a sound, a settling of beams. Mr. Hargreaves did not look at anybody. He looked at the tray, at his own reflection distorted in silver. When he spoke, it was like hearing a man's first truthful sentence in a language he has not dared to speak. I told her, he said. I told her no. I was not merchandise, nor a petition, nor a trophy to place in a glass case. I was the boy she sent away to service and wrote about when it suited her. I told her the only thing she could give me was my name, my father's name, and that she must keep her money as a relic of her meanness. Beatrice made a small sound and took one step toward him as if toward a precipice, then stopped herself, knuckles white. Mrs. Whitfield raised a handkerchief to her lips and at last, perhaps for the first time in years, had nothing pretty to say. The Colonel stood like a tree struck by lightning from a blue sky. Crail said, not unkindly, Mr. Hargreaves, did you kill her? Hargreaves raised his head. His eyes were old and blazing. No, he said. I would have taken her by the shoulders and shaken her until the lace fell off her like leaves, but I would not poison as she poisoned.
I am my father's son, not hers. Who is your father?
Miss Marple asked, so softly the question barely disturbed the air. Hargreaves' mouth twisted. A gardener of sorts. Name not required for this confession. He glanced very briefly at the Colonel, then away. I did not kill her, he repeated. Miss Marple looked at him as she would look at a leaf that had at last turned in the correct season. No, she said, you did not. Crail's breath went in. He checked it.
Then who?
Miss Marple lifted a hand. One moment more. We must place our pieces. She turned to the piano and nodded once. The Colonel, awkward and obedient, set his fingers to the keys. Out drifted a soft, halting thread of the anthem. Quiet as a remembrance, steady as a heartbeat. Consider. Miss Marple said over the music, who most feared the signing of that codicil, not for money, but for the movement it represented. Lady Agatha was about to perform a moral act, however belated. She would acknowledge that she had made a child. Gray's face did not change. Not even his eyelids moved. For a long moment, he was exactly the elegant silhouette of a solicitor anyone would trust to measure out grief in legal ounces. Then he seemed to sigh from the center of his life. "In the candlestick," he said quietly, "folded inside the sconce, so that when the light went down, and I asked Hargreaves to attend to it, as I always do, you know, Mrs. Marple, a habit is a mercy in a murder." He would lift the lace to Lady Agatha with the same respectful gesture he has performed since he was a boy.
And he looked at no one.
She would make her little play. The Colonel's hands fell from the keys. The anthem's last chord hung like a question and did not find an answer. Beatrice put her hand to her throat and did not faint. She would not waste a feint on Mr. Gray. Crail stepped forward, voice iron. "Why?" Gray's mouth lifted at one corner in an expression almost like grief. "Because she intended to turn our house into a courtroom and herself into the judge who forgives. Because she would spend money to purchase a word, child, back from the world, and I would not permit it."
"I was that child once, not hers." "Another lady's. They all perform the same act in the end. They absolve themselves with a cheque." "And so you poisoned her?"
Crail barked.
"You who removed the name to save Hargreaves's dignity? You murdered to save a language?"
Gray's civility cracked at last. "To stop a contagion," she wrote to the man you think is Hargreaves' father, and to others, "stirring old styes." She peered into coffins and called it charity. "I have watched such women all my life. They prefer to name what they hurt rather than cease hurting. She would have called him son in public, Inspector, with all the cruelty of ceremony, and a dozen gossips would have had their lace work."
"I would not see it. You might have waited," Miss Marple said.
"You might have persuaded her, or resigned." He looked at her with a sudden unguardedness that made him almost handsome. "You know very well, Mrs. Marple, that some women cannot be persuaded and that resignations are merely a more elegant form of failure." She inclined her head. "That is sometimes true." Gray's gaze drifted to Beatrice and softened with a tenderness for which he would not forgive himself.
"And I thought to spare the girl," he said.
The old woman made a game of dangling lace and law in front of her.
"I thought, if the game ends, perhaps the girl can at last." "Breathe," Beatrice's voice came, clear and shaking. "You killed her for me?"
"For the possibility of you," he said. She took her hand from her throat, and if there was a weapon in her face, it was pity. "You do not know me at all, Mr. Gray." Miss Marple laid the handkerchief down. "Our pattern is seen," she said. "We will not improve it by staring longer."
"Inspector, shall we—"
Crail moved. The pair of handcuffs, flat and quiet, appeared in his hand like a mundane epilogue. Mr. Gray looked at them, then at Miss Marple, and there was a fatigue in his eyes like a man who has come at last to the end of a very long corridor he built himself. "I require," he said, "only that Hargreaves not be damned by the codicil. He is a good man to the bone."
"Lady Agatha did not give him his goodness." "No," Miss Marple said softly.
She did not. She looked at Hargreaves. "You may, if you choose, keep the scrap of paper or burn it."
"Names are not always what make us." Hargreaves lifted his head with a dignity that did not need lace.
"I shall choose," he said. Crail took Mr. Gray's arm, not roughly. The solicitor did not resist. He glanced once at Beatrice. She did not look away. There was no forgiveness there, but there was something that did not humiliate either. The acknowledgement that harm had been done in the name of a good she had not asked for. 8 o'clock, Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. The lamps made a soft field of gold around them all. A faint draught ran through the room. The lace upon the piano trembled. The case had turned, all at once, from a study of poisons to a study of rescue gone wrong. Miss Marple stood very still, listening to the silence after the anthem,
and thought, we are so clumsy with love when shame is involved.
We build machines to perform the absolution our mouths are too frightened to attempt. She folded her hands. We will meet again, she said, in the next room, where truth has its reckoning. Chapter 5. The drawing-room of Windermere Lodge received them all once more, as if a stage called back its company for the final act. Lamps burned low. Rain stitched its small, persistent seams against the pane. Somewhere beyond the corridor, a clock rehearsed the patience of minutes. Inspector Crail stood by the mantel with the controlled stillness of a soldier in a chapel. Miss Marple, slight and composed, occupied the centre of the carpet with the authority of a seamstress who has no need to raise her voice to be obeyed. Mr. Gray, pale but precise, had been settled in a chair apart, a constable in the shadow near his shoulder. Beatrice stood to one side of the hearth, hands at her skirts but no tremor in them. Mrs. Whitfield, diminished now that melodrama had been replaced by truth, sat near the piano and dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief that, for the first time in recent memory, did not smell of violets. Hargreaves waited at the door, profile grave as a brass rubbing. "Let the record of this room be clean," Inspector Crail said, his tone spare. "We proceed." Miss Marple inclined her head, and the silver in her hair gathered the lamplight like wisdom. "There is a particular cruelty," she began, "in killing a woman by means of the prettiness she taught herself to worship. Lace is thread given the dignity of design. It has no spirit of its own. Yet last night it carried a will, the will of a man who believed himself an apothecary of moral corrections." Mr. Gray's mouth tightened. He said nothing. Miss Marple continued, her voice even and almost tender. "Lady Agatha, as many here know, kept her lace as other people keep diaries. In those threads she stored her ideas of family and rank and propriety. 6 months ago, arsenical papers were ordered to preserve that collection. Whether her own thought or the advice of a Bath needlewoman, the practice introduced poison into the chapel of her memory. The residue lay upon a number of pieces, but 3, each with edges stiffened, as careful housewives used to do with sweetened sighs, drank the most. In the room next door, upon the port tray, a faint, dried kiss of wine had preserved the phantom of a pattern, roses twined with thorns. 2 handkerchiefs in that pattern existed in this house, one Lady Agatha's, one the keepsake of her dead sister, Beatrice's mother. Beatrice did not move, yet something in her face altered, not collapse, but a loosening of a bandage one has worn too long. "The twin," Miss Marple said, "was the instrument, not the port, not the decanter, not the bottle. Lace, placed over a glass, draws up a film. Through that film poison passes."
Lady Agatha had a small vanity. She would play at veiling her drink.
"It is a sort of flirtation with fate, learned perhaps in youth, repeated often enough that those who observed her could rely upon it. Mr. Gray relied upon it. She did not look at him as she spoke his name. She looked instead at the candles, at the candlesticks whose brass cups would cradle a folded square without notice to any but a housekeeper or a murderer. In the interval between dessert and port, she went on gently. Mr. Gray placed the treated handkerchief inside the sconce of that far candlestick. He had earlier remarked, in the voice of habit, that a draught must be seen to, and he would again, when the light faltered, call upon the butler to assist the candles. He counted upon the economy of a house where roles repeat and men reach for their duties by reflex. Mr. Hargreaves, summoned to correct the flame, would naturally draw out the little square, with or without knowing he had done so, and, as tidy men do without thinking, place it upon the nearest cleared surface, the port tray, the table edge, the folded napkins awaiting coffee. Hargreaves stared at the candlestick with a steadiness that told of old humiliations absorbed and outlived. "I did as I have always done," he said softly. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "and because you did, Lady Agatha could play her old game." She lifted lace as if to make pretty the rim she did not trust to be pretty by itself. She laughed. Several of you recall the sound and drank. She died by a gesture she believed she owned. She turned her pale gaze to the tray upon which the faint print of the rose design had been preserved. I would not have known the precise how had I not seen that little ghost of pattern. It was delicate as a moth's wing, yet unmistakable, and it matched the scrap I had taken from the sewing room.
That scrap, the sister, told me there had been a second handkerchief at the table.
When I asked myself who could carry lace from one room to another without remark, the list was cruelly short. The mistress of the house, now dead, her niece whom the house resented, a widow whose hunger for old things exceeds caution, the butler, servant of every ceremony,
and the solicitor, the man who, because he is the master of papers, is rarely watched when he touches anything that looks like paper. Inspector Crail gave a small grunt that was close to admiration. Miss Marple's hands, lightly clasped, did not tremble.
But the why would not sit still until I found the oak leaf. A watermark upon the torn letter addressed to Lady Agatha, a letter written in a careful, round hand by a person who had been told as a child to make his loops neat, and the same leaf impressed upon a box of correspondence in the sewing room. Within that box I found 4 notes bound with green ribbon and labelled, in Lady Agatha's own hand, Child. They were written by a boy who was not. Mrs. Whitfield turned, stunned, to the butler.
"Oh, my dear soul."
Hargreaves' eyes did not leave the tray. They were, for the first time in his life, unafraid of being seen. "Madam," he said without rancour, "I'm not your dear soul. I am my own." Miss Marple gave him a look that was not pity, it was recognition. We asked then, did Mr. Hargreaves kill the woman who would buy his absolution? His anger was human and very old, but the method was not his. The switch at the candlestick required the smooth audacity of a man accustomed to moving between necessity and appearance. It required a mind trained to think, if I call for the candle, the butler will come. If the butler comes, the lace will be freed. If the lace is freed, the woman will choose it because it belongs to a ritual she considers her own. It required, too, the caution to remove a name without destroying it, to keep the lid of the box, so to speak. While discarding the box, she turned to Grey then, at last, with that quiet firmness which in Miss Marple amounts to judgment.
"Mr. Grey, you changed the candle."
"You placed the handkerchief. You orchestrated the guttering. When the lights wavered, you spoke, politely, conventionally, the single sentence that would ensure the trap you had set would spring. Mr. Hargreaves."
"If you please, the man you believed you were saving became the hand that fetched his own murder implement to his mistress's glass." Grey breathed in
deeply, the first uneven breath since his confession. "Yes," he said.
"And I would that I had had the courage to do it openly as a duel and not by lace."
"But courage," he added with a brief, bleak smile, "is rarely furnished in the quantities one orders." Crail's jaw hardened. "Do not dress it up, sir. You poisoned a woman in her own house." "You will meet the Crown." "I will," Grey said. "And I will say, as I said, that I did it to arrest the spreading of a contagion, the performance of penitence upon living flesh. But I will go." "There is still the matter of when you cut the name," Miss Marple said.
"I think you did it only after the death."
To remove the last bargaining chip to ensure the world would not absorb even the mercy she meant to spend, Grey considered, and for once did not play at dignity. "Yes," he said.
"After," Beatrice's voice sounded then clear, winter bright. "And what of my mother's handkerchief? You used that 2-key to make her die by my mother's lace."
Grey turned, and there was genuine sorrow in him.
"I took it from the screen yesterday, Miss Windermere. I am ashamed of that. I thought, a terrible thought, that it would be fitting that the sister's lace end the other sister's violence, as if symbol could make justice look like art." His voice roughened.
"I've been too long among papers. One forgets that people are not documents to be amended." The room held stillness like a held breath.
At last, Colonel Denton, who had been locked in his own hard silence, spoke, his voice low and level.
"She was a tyrant, Grey, but a living tyrant is not improved by becoming a dead one. You have robbed that girl of the right to choose what to do with her own enemy." Grey closed his eyes briefly, as if granting the blow.
I know. Miss Marple took a small step.
bringing herself precisely between Grey and Beatrice with the sort of unconscious grace that belongs to women who have protected children in lanes and kitchens for 40 years. "No verdict," she said. "We'll unknot the past. But we must not let this house continue to speak in the old voice." "Inspector." Crail drew himself up. The cuffs, when they closed upon Mr. Grey's wrists, made no clang. They made a small, definitive sound like the click of a locket being shut upon a miniature one cannot bear to see. "Oliver Grey," he said, "you are under arrest for the wilful murder of Lady Agatha Windermere by means of poison. You may reserve your defence. Anything you say now will be taken down and may be used against you." Grey bowed his head. "Then I will say only this." He turned to Hargreaves. "I did not mean to make you the instrument, Thomas."
"I meant to spare you." Hargreaves's answer had no heat, only a terrible dignity.
"Spare me, sir, by not deciding my life for me." Grey looked at Beatrice. "And you, I wished you breathing room." "I will take it," Beatrice replied, steady as a bell. "Without owing it to you." The constable led Grey away. His footsteps faded along the corridor. The house absorbed them and did not return them. For a few moments, no one moved. The rain at the windows sounded like the softest of applauses, not in approval, but in recognition that a play had ended and life would have to resume its line. Mrs. Whitfield sobbed without ornamentation. The Colonel cleared his throat, wiped at his moustache, and stood at attention before Beatrice with a comic, lovely awkwardness.
"Miss Windermere," he said.
"You will, I hope, forgive an old soldier for not being quick enough today. If there is anything in a practical way, by repairs, accounts—"
"A difficult letter, I can be told." Beatrice looked at him and let something gentle pass across her eyes.
"Thank you, Colonel. I shall ask." She turned to Hargreaves then, and she did something that made every soul in the room straighten as if at a hymn. She gave him a small curtsy, simple, grave. "Mr. Hargreaves," she said, formally, "I have never addressed you as my cousin. I will not presume to begin. But this house has been yours in labour longer than it has been mine in name. Will you remain if you choose? Not as a penitent under charity, but as a man whose work is honoured?" For an instant Hargreaves' face looked like a child's, the child in the round hand, the child at the kitchen table, told to write neatly for the lady of the house. Then he mastered himself. "Miss Windermere," he said, voice thick, "if you will have me, I will remain until you have no further use for me, and after that I will go with thanks." "That is all. That is a great deal," she answered quietly. Inspector Crail coughed, reached for his hat, and then did not put it on, sensing that the sacred part of the evening was not yet done. Miss Marple moved to the piano, lifted the lace, and folded it in her hands with the care one gives an old wedding veil after its duties are finished. "There will be inquests, forms, the exaction of the law," she said gently. "But for tonight, Beatrice, allow me to leave everything open to let the house breathe, and lock nothing that does not wish to be locked. Grief is poorly stored."
"It moulders." Beatrice nodded. The little company dispersed slowly.
With the peculiar hush that follows a reckoning, Mrs. Whitfield left without flutter, the Colonel with a proud clumsiness, Crail with a last grateful glance at Miss Marple like a salute done from the pocket rather than the parade ground. Hargreaves remained, as if a butler cannot properly depart his own corridor. Miss Marple came to him. "Thomas," she said, in the voice one uses for a tired child, and he flinched only once at the name. "You may burn that torn flap, or keep it in your drawer with your collar studs.
Either way, you will still be yourself in the morning." He regarded her as if he had wandered a long way and found at last a bench he could sit upon without first being told to stand.
"I think," he said slowly, "that I shall keep it to remind me what I survived, and to remind me that lace is never armour." "No," Miss Marple said, "the only armour worth the wearing is decency, and that is not impenetrable, but it does not cut the skin of others as it guards your own." She left him then, the house breathing differently around them both, less like a chest bound in stays, more like a field at dusk when the wind is tired. At the threshold, Miss Marple paused and looked back into the room. Its lamp soft, the piano quiet, the tray wiped, the handkerchiefs folded and put away. The past had not been absolved. It had merely been named, which is the first honest thing one can do with the past. "Good night," she said into the room, to whomever might listen, to the dead, to the living, to the lace. "Good night," Miss Marple's reflection. The following evening found Miss Marple alone in her little sitting room, where the lamplight was kind and the fire spoke softly of ordinary things. Outside, the rain had gone at last. In its place, the moon hung white and clear above St. Mary Mead, turning the garden paths into ribbons of pearl. The village slept under its quilt of roofs and chimneys, unaware that another of life's intricate patterns had been woven and concluded. On the table beside her, a single length of lace lay folded, the twin to that which had carried poison. Miss Marple had asked Beatrice for it that morning, and the girl had given it wordlessly, as one might surrender a relic not of faith, but of endurance. It was clean now, washed of all residue, yet when Miss Marple's fingers brushed its edge, she fancied she could still feel the chill memory of what it had done. She looked into the fire. "Lace," she murmured. "A thing that holds its beauty by its emptiness." A spark rose, then fell, much like pride. In the calm that follows resolution, thoughts take their true shape. Miss Marple saw again the faces of those who had moved through Windmere Lodge, each caught in the net of Lady Agatha's long shadow. Mrs. Whitfield, fluttering between admiration and envy, her life forever scented faintly of regret. Colonel Denton, stout-hearted, longing for battles he could understand. Beatrice, burdened by a heritage of cruelty, who now must learn that forgiveness is not weakness but will. Thomas Hargreaves, who had lived a lifetime in service and silence, only to discover that his servitude had been the mask of an old sin, and Mr. Grey, the solicitor who believed that righteousness could be managed like a ledger. He had mistaken control for mercy and intellect for justice. Such men, Miss Marple knew, were far more dangerous than those who acted. She turned down the lamp, the light shrinking to a tender glow. Outside, the wind lifted through the hedges with the soft sigh of something released, not haunting, not mournful, simply finished. Miss Marple placed the lace beside the candle on her table, where its shadows wove their pale pattern over the wood. She whispered, not to the lace, nor to the past, but to the quiet itself. And as the candle burned low, another secret met its shadow. Candlelight Mysteries. Channel. Message. The flame flickers low. A soft wind whispers through unseen curtains. And the narrator's voice returns, calm and velvety as dusk. Thank you, dear listener, for joining us tonight in this tale of lace and shadow, of pride and mercy, of secrets too long preserved. In the stillness of Miss Marple's world, we have seen how guilt may wear silk gloves, and how even the gentlest thread can bind a soul. For beneath every refinement, every whisper of civility, the truth waits, patient, shining faintly beneath the candlelight. The music swells, quiet strings and the faint crackle of fire. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Candlelight Mysteries, where every secret is revealed by the soft glow of candlelight.
Until next time, keep your lamps burning low, your hearts open, and your minds keen. A pause.
The last note lingers, trembling like a final breath. Another secret fades by candlelight.